I'm Nina Zaneri. I'm Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and we're thrilled to have you here live and in person, and I think we have a fairly robust audience virtual as well. This is our fall Lowell Lecture Series that we do every year. Our topic this year is From Puritans to Catholics, Religion in Boston's North End. And we really thought, because there are two wonderful anniversaries in the North End, Old North Church at 300 years and St. Leonard's at 150, that this was a good time to look at how religion has shaped the North End with regard to cultural expression, demographics, political affiliations, and economic status. Our partners for this series are our host, Suffolk University, so thank you, Suffolk, for this wonderful space. Also, the North End Historical Society, Old North Illuminated, and Catherine is here with us. GBH, our wonderful live stream and recording partners, and of course, the Lowell Institute, who's our generous funder. Tonight, we're thrilled to have Professor Jaimie Crumley with us. Jaimie is an assistant professor in gender and ethnic studies at the University of Utah, has a PhD in gender studies from UCLA, and she has amazingly and wonderfully used a number of fellowships recently to pursue some really dramatic new research, including a study of people of African and indigenous descent at Old North Church from 1723 to 1860. And she's also currently working on New England Black women abolitionists, theologians, sisters, and friends from 1770 to 1870. And if you have not done it, I recommend you, after this talk, go right to Old North's website and look at the wonderful Illuminating the Unseen video series. It's really great. It's award-winning, and it's definitely worth your time. Tonight, Jaimie will look at the Church of England's interventions in the Puritan North End with Old North's founding in 1723. She will also discuss the previously less well-known role of people of color in the Old North community during its early days. And I will say that our colleagues at Old North Illuminated have done a really fabulous and remarkable job of looking at the church outside of the Paul Revere story, which of course is near and dear to us at the Paul Revere House, but talking really about the church and its own history, which is really wonderful. Please join me in welcoming Jaimie for her talk.
Thank you so much, Nina. Am I okay for the live stream audience? Everybody can hear me? Okay, awesome, fabulous. And I know you can hear me in the room, both because I am loud and because these microphones are live. Thank you so much to the event organizers for inviting me to speak to you this evening about some of the contradictions in the history of Boston's famed Old North Church. Before I get too deeply into the lecture, I have some people and some groups that I want to thank. This evening, our lecture is being live streamed from Boston, Massachusetts. Some of us are in the room together today. I know that there are others joining, I'm sure, from other places in Massachusetts and perhaps around the country. The historical record tells us that English settlers first arrived on this land in Massachusetts in 1630, but we know that they were not the first ones here. This is the ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag people. I also am here with you today from Utah. The land on which my university sits is named for the Ute tribe. It is the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. Long before any non-native people lived on these lands, native peoples honored and cared for them. As scholars like Jean O'Brien remind us, we must not disappear native peoples, their histories, or their ongoing lives and cultures. So my first thank you is to this land and to the indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for being our teachers and for constantly reminding us of our responsibility to be in loving community with all of creation. Thank you also to the sponsors of this event, Suffolk University History Department, GBH, the Paul Revere House, and the North End Historical Society for hosting this evening's lecture. It is never easy to pull together an event, and I'm grateful for your labor of love as we celebrate the histories of the Old North Church, which is celebrating its 300th anniversary this year, and St. Leonard's Church, which is celebrating 150 years. I appreciate the commitment of all of these organizations to public history and to Boston's religious history. Thank you also to the Lowell Institute for funding this lecture series. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not offer a special thanks to my friends at Old North Illuminated, the organization that helps to preserve the history of the Old North Church. As Nina mentioned earlier, I was so privileged to be their research fellow during the 2022-2023 academic year. It is a greater honor to maintain a relationship with them as they continue their good work. So thank you to Old North Illuminated for being one of the co-sponsors for this event. And although the congregation of Old North is not an official sponsor for this event, I also want to thank the congregation and the staff. After 300 years, people who are local to Boston and people from around the world continue to worship at the Old North Church every week. The congregation of the Old North Church is committed to recognizing the histories of racism and slavery in the church and grappling with those histories and their implications. This work is never easy, but it is critical. The findings of institutions, including churches, primary and secondary schools, community centers, and colleges and universities that are doing this work can and should impact us on more than just the intellectual level. The findings of this research should fundamentally change our approach to dismantling oppressive systems. Finally, I want to offer a word of thanks to the staff at the various archival repositories throughout Massachusetts where I conducted my research about the Old North Church. I completed most of this research at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is here in Boston. The MHS maintains the church's archival records. However, I also conducted research at the Boston Public Library, the Boston Athenaeum, and the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. So without further ado, let's get into our lecture. Our lecture this evening will proceed in two parts. First, I'm going to acquaint you with some of Old North's early history. The Old North Church is a unique church in this city for several reasons, and one of those reasons is its denominational affiliation. Old North, King's Chapel, and Trinity Church were all founded here in Boston during the colonial era. All three are Church of England parishes. And if you are familiar with the religious history of early Boston, you know that Church of England parishes were outliers in a largely Puritan or congregational city. Therefore, for three Church of England parishes to emerge in this city between 1688 and 1733 is unexpected, and it's worthy of our historical inquiry. Second, I'm going to introduce you to three contradictions in the history of the Old North Church. In short, these contradictions are the church's location, the historical memory of the church, and the church's participation in colonialism and slavery. I will leave time at the end of the talk for your questions and comments. This year, the Old North Church celebrates its 300th year as a congregation. We cannot do history to that entire 300-year history this evening. Therefore, tonight, I'm just going to focus on the church in the colonial period. The church's colonial history began with the initial conversations about the church's founding in 1722 and ended with the church's temporary closure in April of 1775. The church was one of many institutions that were impacted by the commencement of the American Revolutionary War. Although the focus of this talk is the church's first 53 years, during the question and conversation segment, we can discuss the church's history during the early Republic and antebellum periods. During the talk, I'm going to call the church Christ Church, which is its formal name, and the Old North Church interchangeably, just to confuse you. During the colonial period, the church most frequently appears in the archival record either as Christ Church or the Church of Minister X or Y. Those who are familiar with Boston's geography probably know that the reason why the church is nicknamed Old North is because of its location in Boston's North End neighborhood. Today, the church is also called Old North because it was founded in 1723, and it is the oldest extant church building in the city. Finally, before we commence part 1 of the talk, I want to explain the title. I'll go back to the title slide. Our subject this evening is Old England in New England. I have chosen this title for a few reasons. First, the talk is called Old England and New England because of Boston's three colonial Church of England parishes: King's Chapel, Christ Church, and Trinity. Together, these three churches brought English religion, politics, and culture to colonial New England. As churches that were supported by the British Crown, they were not exclusively spiritual places. They were also political places that disrupted the theocracy that had been maintained for almost a century in New England. Second, and this point relates to the first, this talk's title reflects the emergence of two Church of England parishes in Boston: Old North in 1722 and Trinity Church in 1733. This evening, I'm going to show that despite our characterization of Boston as a Puritan town, in the early 18th century, the religious, cultural, and political landscape in Boston was shifting. For more than three decades, King's Chapel stood alone in Boston. So the founding of two new parishes is revealing. We can credit the shift to an influx of immigrants who wanted to worship in the tradition of their homeland. However, I also hope to demonstrate this evening that there was a shift in religious attitude between the generations in New England. By the 1730s, a new generation of young people born in New England were less anxious to separate themselves from English religious and social culture. They believed they could immerse themselves in Anglo-American culture while also maintaining their distinctive New England identities. However, they also surprised older generations because they were willing to try other faith traditions, including the one their ancestors fled from England to avoid. And third and finally, this talk is called Old England and New England because in the early 18th century, New England evolved from being a strictly Puritan culture into one that embraced greater religious and cultural diversity, at least among the Protestant Christian traditions. This evolution teaches us a lesson about the politics of Boston in the 50 years preceding the American Revolution. It is a lesson that we might not expect. The political theory of the American Revolution resounds in many of our minds, but in the British colonies, the Revolutionary War was waged between Old England and the 13 British colonies on the eastern shore of what would become known as the United States. This was a war between an established empire and an emerging one. The two empires had their political disagreements, and those disagreements mattered. However, I also hope to show this evening that care existed between the old empire and the emerging one. In the moment of war, British colonists battled British soldiers. The battle was waged on soil that came to be called the United States after the war was won. In a sense, the American Revolutionary War was a civil war with implications that shook the whole of the British Atlantic world. With that, let's jump into part 1, Old North's early history. September 2nd, 1722, a group of subscribers contributed to building a new church in Boston's North End neighborhood. A group of gentlemen had already purchased the land, and the Reverend Mr. Samuel Miles, the rector of King's Chapel in Boston, we are very close to King's Chapel right now, had invited members of the congregation to join him at a Wednesday evening meeting to discuss plans for the building of a new church. While we can never assume a complete agreement among any group of people, the document indicates that a consensus was that King's Chapel was not large enough to contain all the people who wanted to worship there. By helping to build a new church on the north end of town, King's Chapel could better serve the faithful. The choice to establish the new church should have been unremarkable. People of faith regularly planted houses of worship in colonial Boston. However, what the ministers and members of King's Chapel was doing was a pointed critique of New England's religious establishment. King's Chapel was the first Church of England parish to be founded in New England. Its members now proposed the establishment of a second Church of England parish in a town where most of the Christians were Puritans. The immediate question that pops into the mind of most researchers when they hear this story is, how could it be possible that the Church of England was not only surviving, but also growing in a region that was hostile to it? Before I consider the answer to that question, allow me to share a bit about Samuel Miles and his ministry in Boston. When Miles began his ministry in Massachusetts, opposition to the Church of England was fierce. However, being a nonconformist was in Miles' blood. He was the son of a Baptist minister named John Miles. We know from the travails of Roger Williams that the Baptists faced powerful opposition in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Indulge me while I talk about Baptists for a second. I was raised Baptist, okay? In October of 1635, Roger Williams, who is considered to be the founder of the Baptist denomination in the United States, faced a trial in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The colony's governor, John Winthrop, enumerated 4 charges against Williams. The first charge was in response to Williams' critique of King Charles holding property in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Williams argued that indigenous peoples were the rightful inhabitants of the land and that anyone who lived on the land should compensate local peoples for it. The second charge was in response to his belief that no one should be required by law to pray. The third charge related to Williams' insistence that ministers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony formally break ties with the Church of England. New England Puritans critiqued the Church of England, but England remained their home nation, and the colony's legitimacy depended upon the fragile balance of their separation from the Church of England. They could not formally reject the church and expect to survive as a colony. The fourth charge was against his belief that no state ought to police its people's conscience. Williams argued that each person ought to regulate their own conscience. We can learn much about Samuel Miles through our knowledge that he was the son of a Baptist minister. Most of us who are here this evening probably do not live in theocracies and consider people's religious beliefs to be private and personal. However, in colonial New England, theology was overtly political. So after his graduation from Harvard in 1684, Samuel Miles taught for a while in Charlestown. He went to England for ordination within the Church of England in 1687, and when he returned to Boston, he became the rector of King's Chapel. Founded in 1686, King's Chapel became the first Anglican parish in the entire New England region. Until Massachusetts received its provincial charter in 1691, the leaders of the Church of England in New England faced intense religious persecution. Samuel Miles and other Anglican leaders described the church's, quote, dissenting neighbors, end quote, as malicious. With the end of the New England theocracy in 1691, the Church of England gained legitimacy in New England. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was now chosen by the Crown. With the Crown's new authority in the colony, King's Chapel now received gifts from the Crown that financially enriched the church. When King's Chapel opened for its first service in 1686, no one in New England could have predicted that a mere 36 years later, Samuel Miles, Boston's Anglican minister, would participate in helping to establish Christ Church. Christ Church was a Church of England parish that would enjoy the rectorship of Timothy Cutler for its first 42 years. Much like Samuel Miles, Cutler was an unexpected Anglican leader in colonial New England. Before his ordination in the Church of England, Cutler was an emerging leader in the Congregational Church. In 1719, Cutler became the third rector, which today we might call this person the president, of Yale College in New Haven, Connecticut. Yale was established in the colonial period to train young men for ministry in congregational churches. On September 13th, 1722, Cutler was in the college's library, along with students and faculty. He and other faculty had sent a letter to declare that they believed their ordinations were invalid, and that the only ordination that was valid was that they could be provided within the Episcopal Church. Without getting too much into the weeds on the theology that compelled their choice, their primary theological concern was one of church governance. Most congregational churches were, as the name implies, governed by the will of the congregation. Churches that were governed in the congregational way were critical of the Episcopal Church, in part because they believed that the church maintained too many of the hallmarks of the Roman Catholic Church, which the Reformers had tried to stamp out. The monarch was the head of the Church of England and presided over a hierarchy of bishops and priests. Therefore, the Church of England parishes were at once national churches and local churches. The choice of all but one of the ministers in the New Haven Association to declare their ordinations invalid caused mass confusion among the congregations in Connecticut because their members did not know how to respond. After the public declaration, many of the ministers continued to lead their churches, leaving church members concerned about what it meant for them to receive spiritual care from ministers who doubted the validity of their own ordinations. If they doubted their own ordinations, did that mean that they also doubted the church itself? Considering that congregational churches were a central part of not only spiritual but political and social life in the colonies, this turn to the faith of Old England threatened the status quo. So the lingering question that remains is why Timothy Cutler, who by all accounts was a rising leader in the congregational church and who worked in a region that was dominated by congregational churches, would reject his own ordination and would declare his allegiance exclusively to the episcopacy. This change uprooted his life. It required him to spend a year in England preparing for ministry in the Church of England. Moving from New Haven to Boston with his large family caused him financial distress. Of course, Cutler was a theologian, so we could accept that he and several of his colleagues in the congregational church had been gathering for theological conversations, and that they legitimately questioned the doctrine of the congregational church. However, the timing of Cutler's declaration is telling. As church leaders in New England, Cutler and his colleagues likely knew about the plans to establish Christ Church. Regardless of how long Cutler had been contemplating his transition away from the congregational church and into the Episcopal Church, it does not seem coincidental that a mere 11 days after the document I showed you earlier was circulated, Cutler was prepared to publicly declare his allegiance to the episcopacy. We know that at least one minister in Boston was cynical about Timothy Cutler's ascendancy within the Episcopal Church. Henry Harris, who had been appointed as the assistant minister at King's Chapel, was allegedly quite angry that he was not chosen as the first rector of Christ Church. He turned against Cutler and accused Cutler of uplifting himself over the good of the churches. He and Cutler maintained a publicly contentious relationship. It sounds like they were at the churches down the street preaching against each other in their sermons, preach-offs. Notably, the people of King's Chapel and Samuel Miles publicly supported Cutler in the dispute. It is probably too strong a stance to describe Cutler as a mere opportunist. We have no reason to doubt his passion for his beliefs. However, his prominent position at Yale and his contentious move to Boston to become the rector of Christ Church reveal that he was a shrewd young religious leader who wanted to make his mark. Despite ongoing hostility in New England against the Church of England and Timothy Cutler himself, I'll speak more about that in part 2 of this talk,
The Church of England's presence in New England was growing in the 18th century. In 1727, Timothy Cutler wrote to the secretary of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in London. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or the SPG, was founded in 1701. It was the largest missionary organization in the 18th century British Atlantic world, and the major financial contributor to colonial Christchurch. In the letter, Cutler reveals that the Church of England grew because of what Cutler called, quote, the accession of strangers from foreign parts and the church's daily victories over the prejudices of our native dissenters, end quote. If Cutler's assessment is correct, new arrivals to Boston felt most aligned with the religious traditions of their homeland. In New England, they sought a church that allowed them to worship in ways that felt traditional and authentic to them. Furthermore, Cutler's words indicate that he was not the only Puritan whose attitude toward Puritanism was changing. More and more so-called native dissenters, that is, New England Puritans, were at least open to religious diversity. In this letter that's here on the screen, Cutler identifies the Sunday after Christmas in 1723 as the first time the congregation gathered for worship. He writes that when the church first opened to worshipers, there were 400. However, the number had grown to 700 to 800 people. That means the church would have been packed to the gills with people who wanted to attend. At the time he wrote, the brick edifice of the church was complete, but the church did not yet have its famous spire. They needed logwood to build that. Despite the young parish's popularity, in 1727, it was considerably in debt. Cutler believed that were these problems resolved, there would soon be a new Church of England parish in town. Indeed, the church gained the contributors it needed to fill its needs, and in 1733, Trinity Church joined the Church of England parishes in the city of Boston. Like other English churches in New England, Old North was an interracial church that maintained racial segregation during worship. In some of the other British colonies, especially on the southeastern shore, the clergy were anxious about the idea of welcoming enslaved Black people into the churches because of a fear that baptism within the church would mean that they would also be free from enslavement. In some of the colonies, white people refused to be baptized in Anglican churches that also baptized free and enslaved Black people. They chose private baptisms at home instead. However, Timothy Cutler and other Northern clergy believed that they had a sacred duty to Christianize and baptize Indigenous and African peoples. During his ministry at the church, Cutler baptized over 50 people who the church records identify as African or Indigenous peoples. We can talk in more detail about the early African and Indigenous parishioners of the Old North Church in part 2 of this lecture, but we learn a lot about Cutler's experiences with these worshipers through his letters to the SPG secretary. We can see through the letters that he carefully tracked his ministry in Massachusetts. He knew how many people he had baptized, how many became communicants, and how many had died in his care. He assessed the character of many of the people to whom he ministered. However, he does not include the names or a significant amount of identifying information about who these people were. His letters also reflected his interest in ministering to African and Indigenous enslaved people in Massachusetts. We see in his letter that one of his communicants was a woman he described as, quote, a Negro slave, end quote, who was, quote, religious and faithful and acceptable to her mistress, end quote. Of course, Cutler's use of the word mistress is a reminder that Anglo-American women also actively participated in the slave economy as enslavers in Massachusetts and throughout the Atlantic world. Cutler's letters reveal that African and Indigenous peoples worshiped at Christ Church, starting in its earliest days. However, the tone of Cutler's letter indicates that these earliest African and Indigenous parishioners came mostly because of the will of their enslaver. Cutler's phrase, Negro and Indian, reveals two things. First, the phrase reveals that African and indigenous peoples had shared experiences of enslavement in colonial New England. The history of Native peoples' enslavement in 17th and 18th century New England is one that is often overlooked. Yet, in one turn of phrase, Cutler reveals that it was commonplace. Second, the phrase reveals that African and indigenous peoples cultivated close relationships in colonial Massachusetts. They cultivated these relationships in all sorts of social places. However, the church was one of the places where these connections were forged. Cutler describes African and indigenous peoples that Christ Church served as, quote, Negro and Indian slaves belonging to his parish, end quote. According to Cutler, some of these, quote, Negro and Indian slaves, end quote, had masters who were preparing them for baptism. But Cutler lamented that there was some remissness on this issue. As I indicated earlier, many enslavers did permit their enslaved people to be baptized at Old North. Cutler's letters are a rich source that allow us to see what life was like at Christ Church during its earliest years. However, these letters also leave us at a loss. The letters contain more details about how the church was decorated than about the people who attended the church. The parish registers reveal the names of people of all races who participated in the church's rituals, including marriage and baptism. However, the names of those who were among the hundreds who attended worship but did not participate in public rituals remains a mystery. Cutler enjoyed a long but sometimes contentious ministry at Old North. While the church called an assistant minister, James Greeton, when Cutler was too ill to fulfill his duties, he maintained the rectorship of Old North until his death in Boston in 1765. After Cutler's death, the congregation called Mather Byles II as their minister. Mather Byles II was a born and bred congregational minister. He was the son of New England luminary and prominent theologian Mather Byles. Mather Byles, the father, pastored the Hollis Street Church in Boston, which was a congregational church. He was also one of the men called upon to examine the enslaved African artist Phyllis Wheatley to determine whether she had written her book of poetry. The group determined that she had, and in September of 1773, she became the first African person in the British colonial history to publish a book of poetry. Byles's father was not the only prominent Puritan minister in his family. On his paternal grandmother's side, Byles II was a descendant of John Cotton, who was a preeminent theologian in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Richard Mather, who was a prominent Puritan clergyman. Richard Mather's son, Increase Mather, was Byles II's great-grandfather. Increase Mather was a prominent Puritan clergyman in New England and the president of Harvard College for 20 years. Richard Mather's grandson, Cotton Mather, was Byles's great-uncle. Cotton Mather was one of the most prominent theologians in the British Atlantic world. I will say more about Cotton Mather's contentious relationship with Timothy Cutler in Christ Church in part 2 of this talk. However, for now, suffice it to say that for a man of Mather Byles II's pedigree to relinquish his congregational ordination and to instead pursue ordination in the Church of England was highly unusual. It is also notable that the church chose to call a man who was related by blood to the Mather family. The Mather family publicly rejected the Church of England, but the leaders of Christ Church had the courage to approach one of its nephews to request his leadership over the congregation. Byles II's openness to the call from Christ Church speaks both to the changing religious attitudes of his generation and the Church of England's rising influence in New England by the 1760s. Byles's relationship with Christ Church began well. Here is a letter that he wrote in 1768 to the wardens and vestry of Christ Church from New London, Connecticut. After great difficulty and expense, he had received permission from his congregation in New London, Connecticut, to leave. He had refunded to the New London congregation £250, which led them to take a public vote to acknowledge his sacrifice and to allow him to depart to serve Christ Church. Although he was now struggling financially, he felt himself at liberty to join with a church that belonged to what he called, quote, a communion which I conscientiously prefer, end quote. He accepted the invitation to become the next rector of Christ Church and prayed that the union would be to the glory of God. Like Timothy Cutler, at the time he accepted the call to serve at Christ Church, Mather Byles II was a congregational minister. In 1768, there was no body in the British colonies that could ordain ministers. Therefore, he traveled to London for his ordination. A group of funders supported his trip. 36 individuals from the congregation contributed to the cause of his trip to England. Don't count what is on that page. This page contains the names of 26 of these individuals. Others were carried on to a second page. Many of these contributors associated their name with their contribution. However, others associated themselves as, quote, a private person, end quote. On September 28, 1768, Byles returned from London and arrived at his new church in Boston. By all accounts, everyone was eager about this new ministerial relationship. But the relationship was not to remain amicable. On Tuesday, April 18, 1775, Byles wrote to the vestry of Christ Church. The relationship between the church and its minister had soured, in large part because they could not afford to pay his salary. The church had faced a similar challenge during Timothy Cutler's ministry. Byles II had been in conversation with the Episcopal Church in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They had called him as their new minister. Although he was still owed part of his salary from Christ Church, he wrote to the Christ Church vestry that he was willing to, quote, give up the keys and quit the church and hope that they will pay me the balance due from the church, end quote. Upon receiving his note, the congregation accepted that he was leaving for the congregation in Portsmouth. Because they could not collect his salary, they accepted his resignation. The church wardens promised to work to collect the balance of the salary as soon as possible. A committee was appointed to share the news with Byles II. When he heard it, the committee reported that he was satisfied with the proceedings. He and his family were supporters of the British Crown and were prepared to begin their new life in Portsmouth. However, because of the war, the family left for Nova Scotia instead. I will speak more about this in a moment, but these interactions with the resigning minister are the only records the vestry has of what happened at their church on April 18, 1775. Without a minister and with the outbreak of war, Christ Church closed its doors until August of 1778, when Stephen Lewis became the church's third rector. The end of Byles II's ministry at Old North provides an ideal transition for us into the three contradictions in Old North's colonial history. While we likely could identify any number of contradictions in the church's early history, I will focus on the following. Contradiction 1 was that the congregation's home was in Boston's congested North End neighborhood. This old neighborhood in the city began as a bastion of Puritanism under the leadership of the Mather family. Yet the Church of England parish attracted many worshipers from a wide array of races and social classes. Contradiction 2 was the events of April 18, 1775. There was some controversy when, in 1960, the Old North Church was recognized as one of many so-called national shrines in the city of Boston. The pastor of Boston's Second Church believed that Second Church was the original and true North Church of the historic signal lanterns. By 1960, the events of April 1775 were a point of pride in American culture. The reaction to the historical events was hushed in 1775. Therefore, the second contradiction I will track are the shifting historical memories of the Old North Church's steeple lanterns. Contradiction 3 was that despite being an outsider sect in the city that longed to be free from religious persecution, the white clergy and parishioners at Old North participated in the dispossession and enslavement of Native peoples and the enslavement of African peoples. The record reflects that during the colonial period, the church never questioned the validity of colonialism and slavery. Let's start with the first contradiction. In part 1 of this talk, I discussed Timothy Cutler's surprising departure from the Congregational Church in the library of Yale College in September 1722. I want us to look together at this map of the city of Boston from 1722. During the question and conversation segment, you can tell me what you notice about this map. What I notice about this map is that it is absolutely packed. Boston was an expensive and congested city, even in 1722. And if you spent any time here, you know that it remains so 300 years later. Churches dotted the colonial landscape. You can see on the legend, which I tried to blow up on the top, that there are several of the locations that are listed are churches, variously described as Old Church, which was founded in 1630, Old South, which was founded in 1669, the Church of England, founded in 1688, Brattle Street Church, founded in 1699, and Quaker, founded in 1710. Although this map was created in 1722, the mapmaker does include Christ Church, although the first worship service was not held there until December of 1723. In addition to the churches, the legend indicates the locations of several grammar schools and the almshouse. When Christ Church was founded, there were already 3 churches, all congregational, in the North End. The minister of the Old North Church in the North End, also called Second Church, was Cotton Mather. I mentioned Cotton Mather earlier in our discussion of Mather Byles II. He belonged to one of New England's preeminent Puritan families. He opposed the Church of England's growth in Boston. When he heard about the problems in Connecticut from ministers there who remained faithful to the Congregational Church, he gathered the opinions of other clergy in Boston before he responded. The ministers collectively agreed that the Connecticut ministers acted in a way that openly disrespected the Congregational Church. Mather and others suspected that Timothy Cutler had been a, quote, secret Episcopalian. I really like that phrase. I'm not sure why, secret Episcopalian. They believed that he had intentionally accepted the position at Yale because of his desire to undermine and destroy the young institution. Despite the opposition, Timothy Cutler and his family moved into the North End, disrupting nearly a century of congregational autonomy in the area, and led a new church in the Episcopal tradition. No one could have expected that this new church would survive to become the oldest extant church building in the city. While many of the congregational churches have consolidated, closed, or changed their denomination, Christ Church and Trinity Church remain within the Anglican tradition from which they were birthed. I just wanted to put these 2 men on the screen together, Cotton and Timmy. I just imagine them having to pass each other on the street and just the awkwardness of it all, and it makes me giggle. Let's move to the second contradiction. Sometime around 1775, Paul Revere was asked to write a deposition about what he had done on the night of April 18th, 1775. Due to time constraints, we won't review the entire letter. However, to summarize, Revere wrote that he was asked by Dr. Joseph Warren to go to Lexington. While there, he was to inform Samuel Adams and John Hancock that there were troops marching to the Common, where boats awaited them. It was supposed that they would use the boats to get to Lexington or Concord to destroy goods that belonged to the colony. Revere immediately proceeded and rode to Charlestown, where Richard Devens told him about the troops he had seen headed for Concord. Revere was almost at Cambridge when he encountered two officers on horseback. He evaded capture and proceeded to Lexington, where he warned Adams and Hancock. From Lexington, he rode on with William Dawes toward Concord. While he was on the way, they encountered a young man named Prescott, who rode with them. This time, when Revere saw the officers ahead of him, they apprehended him. They and the other troops managed to surround Revere and the others they captured. Revere recollected that they rode toward Lexington at a quick pace and heard a volley of guns when they were about half a mile away from the meeting house. Revere told them that the troops that had captured him, that guns were to warn the people in the countryside that they were approaching. The men took Revere's horse and left him behind. He returned to Hancock and Adams to inform them. He wrote that he went with another man to get a trunk of items that belonged to Hancock. While they were out, they encountered the troops and heard gunshots. However, Revere stated that he could not see the militia. Much like the vestry records of Christ Church, Revere's letter says nothing of the church steeple being involved in the evening's events. In so short a time, he could not have forgotten what would become a central part of the evening's narrative. Perhaps he had wanted to protect the church and those who displayed the lanterns. Revere's letter, which he wrote to clergyman and historian Jaimie Belknap about 25 years later, read a bit differently. In this letter, he explained that starting in 1773, he was part of a committee that watched the movements of British soldiers. They held their secret meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern. Because they regularly watched the troops, they noticed movement on Tuesday, April 18th, 1775. Revere wrote that Dr. Warren urgently sent for him at about 10 p.m. to tell Hancock and Adams about the movement. In Charlestown, Revere, with Colonel Connaught and some other gentlemen, agreed that if the troops went out by water, they would show 2 lanterns in the steeple of the North Church. If they went by land, their signal would be 1 lantern. After writing about the signal lanterns, Revere's letters divulged other details about his choices that night. So if we return to our map of Boston, which we looked at earlier, we see that there were, in the late 1770s, a few churches that Revere might reasonably have described as the North Church. When Christ Church reopened after the American Revolution, no mention was made in church records of the signal lanterns or Paul Revere. However, by the antebellum period, it seemed like the church began to take pride in the story and share it with visitors. When poet and abolitionist Henry Wadsworth Longfellow visited Old North in 1860, he was inspired by what he had learned, of what he understood to be the church's historic connections to the events of April 1775. He wrote a commemorative poem that many of us know called Paul Revere's Ride. The poem was first published in the Atlantic Monthly in January of 1861. To return to my argument from earlier that the American Revolution was in reality a civil war, by 1860, Longfellow could see that the nation was on the precipice of another civil war. While we know that there were a few causes for the 1860s Civil War, Longfellow understood slavery to be its primary impetus. He did not want people in the North to be apathetic in the face of racial slavery. Instead, he wanted them to possess the spirit, which he believed that Revere had possessed a century earlier, and to react swiftly against tyranny. Longfellow's popular poem exposed the nation to a history that had largely laid dormant up until that point. In his 1873 remarks in celebration of Christ Church's 150th anniversary, the church's rector, Henry Burroughs, noted that the church's contributions to American Revolutionary history. He told the congregation that with the signal lanterns, the church signaled not only the Revolution, but also the church's departure from the Church of England and its entry into the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. In 1775, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States, of course, was unthought of. Yet we can understand Burroughs' point. It is notable that a Church of England parish that existed primarily because of support from the crown would turn against the crown and herald the birth of a new nation. This event is one of the central contradictions and surprises of American Revolutionary War history. Now let's turn to our third and final contradiction. The Church of England was an outsider sect in colonial New England. Yet leading white parishioners at all three of the colonial Church of England parishes in Boston justified and normalized slavery and colonization. Considering that Old North is remembered as a beacon of so-called American liberties, the contradiction is especially jarring. February 21st, 1736, Timothy Cutler performed the parish's first marriage between people whom the record indicates were Black. The couple was, quote, Henry, Negro servant of Mary Gibbs, end quote, and, quote, Celia, Negro servant of James Green, end quote. The word servant belies that Henry and Celia were both enslaved. We can see on this same page that another of Mary Gibbs' servants, a man called Peter, married a servant named Susanna, who was enslaved by a Daniel Ballard. Henry and Celia, Peter and Susanna were wed according to the liturgical customs of the Church of England. However, as enslaved Africans, theirs would be unions of their own inventions. Henry and Peter's enslaver, Mary Gibbs, was a prominent Christ Church member. Her husband, John Gibbs, was one of the church's first vestry members and an early subscriber who had contributed financially to building the church. Gibbs's wealth and power remind us that white, or more precisely English women, were not powerless in colonial New England, and this was especially true for wealthy English women. In Puritan New England, enslavers modeled what slavery studies scholars call the peculiar institution after the Hebraic model. In New England, most enslaved people were treated as members of their enslaver's family and were called a servant rather than a slave. Most enslaved people in New England were not denied the right to marry, to be baptized in churches, and to become literate. Although they had these freedoms that were so often denied to their counterparts outside of New England, they remained enslaved. They could be bought and sold according to the will of their enslavers. Their children could be given away by enslavers who did not desire to care for a child who did not yield a profit. Even free people of African descent found that their race made them undesirables in colonial New England. The undesirability of free people of color in colonial New England is exemplified in the story of Beulah Speen Rogers. After her 1767 marriage at Christ Church to an enslaved Black man, Speen Rogers, a mixed-race woman of Nipmuc Indian descent, was warned to leave Boston. If we look at this record, which was at the bottom of the screen, we can see that people of all races were told to leave Boston. And they were typically told to leave because they were poor and there was no room for them in the almshouse, or because age, disability, or their neighbors' just general distaste for their presence. People who were warned out could conceivably stay in the city. But if they did, they faced imprisonment or physical punishment for their choice to do so. And this experience of being warned out speaks to the general culture of unfreedom in colonial Boston. This was a culture in which the church actively participated and in some ways created. In the interest of time, we can discuss it further during our question and conversation section, but I want to conclude by us looking at this image. And this image exemplifies the geography of unfreedom which exists within the church building itself. Like most churches in the British Atlantic world, the Old North Church contained box pews. White parishioners could pay for the use of a pew for themselves and their family. Some wealthy New Englanders would purchase pews at churches that they did not actively attend, because pew ownership allowed them to participate in votes about church affairs. Even if they could afford it, no person of color was allowed to own a pew in a colonial English church. Throughout the British colonies, free and enslaved people of color who worshiped at English churches occupied racially segregated seating, often in floors, and as we can kind of see in this image here, in balconies. They were also often kept from approaching the altar rails for prayer and communion. Historians of Atlantic world slavery remind us that slavery is an institution that is as old as humanity itself. While racial slavery has been abolished, legally abolished, all over the world, the sad reality is that structures of unfreedom continue to exist around the world. And the primary victims and survivors of these systems are Indigenous peoples, African people, women, children, and poor people of all races. Because slavery is such an old institution, it is not accurate to argue that Christianity itself produced the logic that justified slavery. However, Christianity has historically been used to justify slavery and its expansion throughout the world. The records of Christ Church reveal that white leaders in the colonial congregation understood slavery to be normal, expected, and something that was worth maintaining. Before we dive into our time for questions and conversation, I want to offer a brief conclusion. The histories of institutions like Old North offer us opportunities to rethink what we believe to be true. The Old North Church is a place that is rich with documentable and verifiable history. It is also a place that is shrouded in historical myths. And when I say that the church is shrouded in myths, I don't mean that in a negative way. The church offers us a meaningful case study to consider how we might ethically study the past. We could have a whole separate lecture, you all could do a whole separate lecture series about how to ethically study the past. However, two things that any historian should keep in mind are to avoid believing that any endpoint is or was inevitable, and to maintain a healthy dose of suspicion about our findings, because history is never settled. With each new piece of data and each new set of interpretive lenses, we learn to reevaluate what we believe to be true. So in the future, when you think about the Old North Church, which I hope you do, I hope you will think about three big ideas. First, I hope that you will think about historical memory. I hope you will consider how our memories are shaped by presence and power. Today's Old North is an imposing presence in the cramped North End neighborhood. It is a place with a long and nearly uninterrupted 300-year history. Few institutions in the United States can say that. Second, I hope that you will think about freedom. The word freedom is a word that is overly burdened in the United States context. We have fought several wars on this soil and elsewhere over the question of freedom. However, the Old North's history compels us to rethink the meaning of freedom. The church's earliest members wanted freedom to practice their religion. However, they also contributed to the crisis of unfreedom in the 18th century Atlantic world. Third, and finally, I hope you will think about possibility. Today in the United States, the study of history is under siege. And there are several reasons why people believe that history itself is a threat. And I think that one of those reasons is because history compels us to think critically and to ask big questions. History alerts us to a revolutionary past. The choices that people made in the past remind us that things do not have to remain as they are. The complex and often contradictory history of the Old North Church is a history of possibility. In many ways throughout its history, the church has fallen short of what we hoped it might have been. But also, at so many times in its history, the church has inspired the nation to be more than what it believed it could be. Now we will have some time for questions and conversation. I call it questions and conversation because I admit I don't have all of the answers. However, I hope that we will spend our remaining time freely sharing our ideas and our considerations for future research. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have questions, I will jog over to you so we can capture them on the microphone. So.
So I was really intrigued by the document you had about folks being warned out of Boston, and I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about that. I guess in particular, like how it was enforced and what the sort of legal process of the city deciding to warn someone out was. Like, was that a complaint anyone could bring, and was there any sort of like trial process about that?
Yeah, so great question. So this process was really common in 18th century Boston. And when people were being warned out, often it was by a neighbor. And we see the people who were typically enforcing that is a group called the Overseers of the Poor, which was a group of gentlemen who, supported and helped with the people in the almshouses, and there would have been, of course, a close connection between people showing up and ending up in almshouses or ending up destitute. So they would have, of course, already been aware of who a lot of these people were. In terms of enforcement, I think historians are still trying to kind of figure out how that played out, because, of course, we know that some people didn't necessarily leave the city because we see them showing up again in the records, and some of them eventually become respectable citizens, right? Maybe they showed up here poor and they decided to, get some money and take care of themselves, and they were allowed to remain in the city. And then we also know of others, for example, an African enslaved man called Mark, who was warned out of the city. It seems like in part he was just rowdy whenever he would come into the city. He was always drinking with his friends, he was misbehaving. And so he got warned out of the city, but we know what happened to him next, which is that he participated in or allegedly participated in a conspiracy to kill and poison his master, and he ended up being executed in Boston. So sometimes we're able to kind of track these long stories. Of course, that wasn't a direct reaction to him being warned out, but it does speak to that kind of culture of unfreedom, that he was unsafe even doing the things that his master allowed him to do, which was to be out in the city by himself, enjoying his time. Thank you for the question.
I'm curious if the history of the congregational churches was different than the Anglican churches when it came to talking about slavery, having African American members, and so forth.
Yeah, so the history is definitely related. In New England, it was really common for African and Native peoples to attend the churches. Of course, I talked about Phyllis Wheatley earlier. She's, of course, a famous example. She attended Old South, or Third Church, in the city of Boston, and she chose to make a public declaration of faith and become a member of that church. The big difference, there's a big theological difference between the Congregational and the Episcopal churches, where in the Episcopal churches, we see people just simply kind of participating in the rites. In the Puritan churches, there's much more of a ritual to actually become a member of the church. And so we see people affiliated with churches, but not necessarily becoming full members of the churches. So that's a difference, but even that, we see a big difference there, even between white folks and black folks. So that wasn't necessarily because someone is black, they're not going to take on the effort to become a full member. However, what did make Old North distinct, which I wanted to point to in the talk and should have pointed to more clearly, is that there were just so many more baptisms of African and indigenous peoples at Old North than the other churches. And we might chalk that up to a theological difference, but we also might chalk it up to just how many, there's been a lot of historical research just about how many African peoples would have been living in the North End before the Revolutionary War, and that might have contributed to how many were worshiping there and finding a spiritual home there.
I have a question from a member of our online audience, a comment and a question. So they say, respective to the buildings for Congregational and Baptists existing at the time, it was a major and commodious new feature on the North End landscape. The wealth of the new congregation surely facilitated its creation even before the steeple went up. And so the commenter is asking, what about Christ Church's property and architecture and financial situation? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Okay, so in terms of the financial situation, that's a great question. So one thing that makes Christ Church different financially is, I talked a little bit earlier, not in great detail, about the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was founded in 1701. A lot of the Anglican churches ended up getting a lot of their funds directly from England. So that's one thing that's going on, that the crown is directly supplying them with things that they need to be able to build and expand the church. Even with that, it takes a lot of time. So one thing that we've learned about Old North is, of course, many of the members, part of the reason why they appreciated belonging to the Church of England was because they were new immigrants. And so that meant that there were a lot of merchants and mariners in the church. And of course, when we think about merchants and mariners, what are merchants and mariners doing? Of course, some of them are privateers and they're able to bring items back to the church. Some of them are also participating in the slave trade, right? Whether they are actually trafficking enslaved people or going to other colonies where there were enslaved people. They're getting the logwood from those locations. They're getting financing from those locations, right? So, some people have asked me, did enslaved people actually build the church? Well, physically, no. We don't have any evidence that enslaved people were actually the laborers that built the church. However, we do know that the profits that a lot of the church members were gaining, in part through the slave trade, all around the British Atlantic colonies and across other empires, was part of what contributed to enriching the church.
I have a quick question. At the Paul Revere House, we sometimes feel constrained by the midnight ride story because it's where the visitors want to start, and we have all these other things we want to talk about. But it's a double-edged sword because it's what brings the people to us, and so then it allows us to talk. You talked a little bit about that. Can you expand on that?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so yes, my friend Catherine is here. So you all can pounce on her after this and ask her about that, because she is actually on the ground doing public history work and encounters, right? The visitors who really come because of their excitement about that story, right? And so in terms of how we navigate that, I don't want to sidestep the question, but I also want to think about what I was saying near the end of the talk about how the field of history itself in a lot of ways is under siege, and the reason for that, there's lots of reasons for that. Another reason, which I didn't mention, is because of the way that it disrupts these stories of great white men in American history, right? And Paul Revere is so interesting, right? Because at the time, it wasn't understood that he was one of these great white men that we need to revere, pun intended. But he became that, right? That's the way we now remember him. And there's a lot of anxiety. For example, if we were to talk about maybe Revere's wife or one of Revere's daughters instead, that would take away our focus from Revere. If we were to talk about an enslaved person like Mark, who Paul Revere mentions in his letter that he rode past the place where Mark was hung in chains. If we were to talk about Mark and center Mark in that story, that would be causing a problem. And so for me, as a scholar who identifies as a Black women's historian and really wants to study and evaluate the lives of Black women, there's something that a lot of, especially Black women's historians recommend, which they call pivoting the center, right? So it's looking at these kind of dominant stories that we do know really well. For example, the story of Paul Revere, and looking at it from a different angle, which allows us to actually expand the legibility of the story and read the story in new ways, right? So we're always able to tell the Revere story. And then we say, but what about this person who was also part of the story but didn't end up being centered in the story? And that is always, if we're talking about the history of colonial America, going to include indigenous peoples, people of color, poor and wealthy white women, right, are always going to be included in that story if we just kind of shift the focus, right? So if people are coming to the Paul Revere House to learn about Paul Revere, that's awesome, of course. That's why they should come to the Paul Revere House. It's named that. But how do we shift the focus when they get there, right? That's the challenge.
I have a follow-up question from the same commenter who asked about the financial situation. They want to know whether the higher number of baptisms of enslaved individuals was reflective of the wealth of the congregants, or I guess the other congregants.
Say again?
They wanted to know whether the higher number of baptisms of enslaved people in this church as opposed to others in the area was reflective of the wealth of the congregation.
Was reflective of the wealth of the congregation. That's a really interesting question that I haven't considered. So maybe that's something I need to take into consideration, that I'm just the sheer numbers of enslaved people who would have been brought to Old North, in part because there were just a larger number of enslavers in the congregation, or people who were holding multiple enslaved people in the congregation. But another thing that I want to say is, not to go back to our friend Timothy Cutler again, speaking of, kind of the great white man of the story, he becomes kind of the great white man in our early story. But one thing is that he was devoted to ensuring that enslaved people were baptized. This was something that was really important to him. And it sounds like he was traveling a lot. And from what you could see even from the letters, he was encountering people of all races. And in almost all of his letters, he talks about enslaved people or African people who he was encountering and who he was baptizing. So I think we can contribute it to wealth. That's something really to think about that I hadn't considered. But we also, I think, ought to contribute it to the kind of leader that he was, that was a really big passion of his. And my supposition about that, as you all can tell, I kind of am cynical about Timothy Cutler, at least his beginnings at Old North. Part of my theory about that is, he left the Congregational Church and he had something to prove. And one of the things he wanted to prove was, I can bring in the most people. So I think that also contributed to his passion for baptizing widely all sorts of people. But yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for that consideration about the connection between finances and baptisms.
We have time for one more question. Anyone? If not, Jaimie, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
And
And
for
there's
the,
my contact information if you're looking for me.
thank you all for coming tonight. We hope you'll join us again on the 26th for our last lecture in this series. Our friend Steve.
Sorry.
Our friend Steve Pullio will be here talking about Catholics. So please join us. Thank you, Jaimie.
Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. Thank you.